Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Dr. Prakash Shah joins me today from London on an important issue. Is the UK one of the first countries which is trying to bring in the blasphemy law, famous in parts of the Islamic world, through backdoor legislation? Dr. Shah is a legal expert and will take us through whether this really is happening in the UK. Prakash Shah, welcome.
Namaste. Thank you.
Dr. Shah, if I may ask you then, from what you are seeing in terms of legislative decisions, in terms of political decisions, do you think that, in a sense, the blasphemy law is being brought into the UK through a back door?
May I respond to something you said in your introductory remarks first? Because it's very important to point out that it's unlikely that it's going to be the UK who has, let's say, a pioneering role in introduction of blasphemy law. And for that, we have to have some kind of historical backdrop. So if you'd like me to go through that just very briefly right now.
Oh, absolutely.
I'd be happy to do so. So
absolutely.
Yeah, so the way I see it is that basically you've got three basic paradigms going on in the world, right? So you've got the, let's say, what's often referred to as the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa region, which has a series of laws which resemble blasphemy laws. Of course, in Islam, there isn't a specific equivalent to, a theological equivalent to what the Christians have referred to as blasphemy. But they have laws which relate to the defamation of religion, if we can use that word temporarily. I'll go into the problem with the defamation of religion issue in a second. So that's one thing. The other paradigm is the one that the British introduced in colonial India, in the Indian Penal Code, and this is a series of religious offences, which function as part of the Penal Code, and these have been inherited not only by India but a whole series of former colonial countries, and have more or less been kept in place, except for the Muslim majority countries which attained independence from the British Empire. And with those, you see a definite, let's say, a move away from the provisions of the Indian Penal Code in an attempt to prioritize Islam or to exclusively refer to Islam in the religious offense laws. And the third paradigm, if you like, is the old Christian blasphemy law, which has prevailed in many parts of the Western world. I think today it's probably only operative in Norway, if I'm not wrong, right? So there's been a huge shift away from blasphemy laws. In Britain, the blasphemy law was abolished by legislation doing away with the old common law offense in, I believe, 2008, right? So what you've got is a paradigm which refers to hate speech, which is not exclusive to any particular religion, but tries to, let's say, clamp down on speech which is deemed to be, let's say, leading to disturbances in public order. Of course, the Americans are an exception to this because they have huge bandwidth within their freedom of speech laws, the First Amendment and so on. So they are actually even resistant to having hate speech laws of the kind that exist in different European countries. So those are the basic three global paradigms in the mix. And so in a way, you can say that the MENA region have already got blasphemy type laws. So do so many of the countries of the British Empire.
Are these laws in a sense being brought in through the back door in the UK?
In the UK, all right, so I mentioned that in 2008, we got rid of the common law offense of blasphemy. That law was exclusively referenced to Christianity. So when the Salman Rushdie affair happened in the late 1980s, early 1990s, a set of Muslim organizations tried to institute legal proceedings to ask the courts in Britain to extend the blasphemy laws to Islam also. That request was rejected, and there was a prevailing opinion that blasphemy laws in Britain are outdated anyway, and we ought to, rather than extending them, we ought to get rid of them. And that's exactly what's happened in 2008. So today you've got a scenario where You do have legal provisions in place. So before we go to the backdoor question, we've got to address the point that we've got offenses which relate to religious aggravation, right? So back in 2001, the then Labour government passed laws to the effect that if you commit an offense which is attended by some kind of objective evidence of religious motivation, then you can actually add on a sentence to the basic sentence for that offense. So that's been prevailing since 2001. Then you've had, in fact, after the terrorist attacks in July 2005, in 2006, the British Parliament passed a law to add religion to the basic public order offenses, which related to racial hatred, right? So you got a whole series of offenses to which religion was added in addition to racial motivation or racial aggravation of some type. So in two senses, religion is already addressed by criminal law legislation in Britain, right? So, and in some ways, that legislation and other legislation, let's say the legislation to do with communications, which India has actually copied almost word for word. And I actually, there's a very interesting reference in British case law, which looks at the Indian Supreme Court interpretation of that, right? And it's one of the few instances where the British courts look to India for ascertaining how precisely we should interpret the scope of this legislation. Anyway, notwithstanding that interesting footnote, the prosecutions have been brought under, let's say, the communications laws, right? So there was a case in Northern Ireland of a preacher who was very outspoken against Islam. And he also went to the extent of saying that he wouldn't trust ordinary Muslims. But in the court, he was actually exonerated because the court said that, well, I don't think that, the judge said that, I don't think that this set of actions or these speech acts are sufficiently grave to constitute gross offense, right? But notwithstanding that, you see that whenever statements are made against Islam, there is a tendency to try to prosecute them. You don't see the same with respect to other religions. For example, Christianity can be abused in this secular age of ours, and it's very unlikely that you'll see those kinds of speech acts being liable to be punished, even prosecuted. Similarly, you see with the, let's say, anti-Semitic or anti-Israeli protests which have happened since October 7th, there's been a lot of evidence of anti-Semitism, and Jewish organizations, Jewish individuals have rightly protested, but there's been very, very few prosecutions of those, right? So what I'm trying to say is that, in fact, today, we have some kind of implicit blasphemy, which tends to protect speech acts against which are critical of Islam and Muslims to a greater degree than other religions are protected. Now, to that, you've got to add the fact that in 2008, an all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, which is constituted of a huge number of then sitting MPs, more than 100 of them actually, and the secretariat for which actually runs the parliamentary group, was provided by an Islamist organization. And that parliamentary group came up with a report containing a definition of Islamophobia. And in that report, the definition was something like as follows. Islamophobia is a form of racism which targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness, right? And since that committee or the parliamentary group has adopted that definition, not forgetting that something like 100 MPs are a member of that group. And as far as I know, there's been no dissent by any of those MPs against the adoption of that report. The same definition has spread through more than 50 local authorities in Britain, right? So what you see here is an attempt to prioritize and privilege offense to one particular religion, right? And not only is that an asymmetrical situation or position to take by a variety of different local authorities up and down Britain, but it also means that there is an implicit pressure to desist from criticizing Islam and Muslims.
I also want to try and understand, as all of this is happening, this entire Islamophobia thing has also grown. And, many parts of many countries, including in the UK, people take the idea of Islamophobia far more seriously. In your, opinion, is Islamophobia in practice, in a sense, the blasphemy law by another name?
Yes, yes. In fact, that's what I was trying to say, right? So Islamophobia, the conception of Islamophobia, actually, you can trace it back. I mean, there is an early 20th century expression of that. I think it was in Egypt or something. But the more updated expressions of Islamophobia actually can be traced back to a 1997 report by the Runnymede Trust in Britain, right? So this was a British NGO concerned with anti-racism issues and so on. But they took the initiative to create a report together with a definition, and it differs somewhat from the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Muslims definition in that it looks at Islamophobia as something which occurs when somebody shows a lack of openness to Islam, right? So basically, you have to be receptive to Islam. If you're not receptive to Islam, you're Islamophobic, according to. And that report has been frequently cross-referenced, not only by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Muslims in 2008, but also at United Nations level, right? And so there I've got to take a detour because, if you permit me, you've got to go back to 1999, which is a couple of years after the Runnymede Trust report, to see that there are initiatives taking place in the United Nations by individual countries who are members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to persuade the membership of the United Nations, either its General Assembly or the Human Rights Commission, now Council, to accept Islamophobia or the defamation of religion as a violation of human rights, right? Now, of course, initially, the proposal was introduced by Pakistan in 1999. It didn't refer to defamation of religion. It referred to defamation of Islam only. And then there was a big reaction, especially by Western countries. And the proposal was watered down and extended to read defamation of religion generally, right? But once you look at the closer detail of the resolutions that began to be passed from that year onwards, you notice that actually the intent is really to refer to Islam, right? Because the content really is heavily Islamic rather than referring to any particular religion. You will get references to things like anti-Semitism, or a new term was coined. As far as I know, it's a new term, Christianophobia. So you get these things in order to legitimize the resolutions that began to be passed through different organs of the United Nations. And that game went on up to something like 2010, 2011, right? After that period, you saw a decline in international support for such resolutions. The Western countries had always been resolutely against these kinds of resolutions because they argued that actually they saw a blasphemy law in that, right? So they read the signals very correctly, I think, right? So for example, if you look at the Charlie Hebdo murders, right? In 2005, I think it was. After that, the Organization of Islamic Countries or Cooperation began to push again for these resolutions. and they said that what the journal Charlie Hebdo had actually done was Islamophobic, and thereby implicitly legitimizing the murders that happened of the journalists of that, in that paper. So you see that the real intent here is to protect Islam, right? And offenses which are Islam. Often there's a kind of switch of terminology, and it's insisted that actually we want to protect Muslims. It's not Islam we're interested in, but Muslims. But really, actually, if you look at the kind of the heavy content of the resolutions, you see that the primary aim is protection of Islam. Now, once you're protecting a religion, it is like a blasphemy law, isn't it? Right? So as I said, that went on until something like 2010, 2011, after which there was a decline in international support, and more countries tended to either abstain or simply vote against this legislation. In the meantime, you see increasing reference to Islamophobia as well. So it's not just defamation of Islam, but you see Islamophobia being used constantly as a term which applies to acts that, let's say, or speech acts that work against Islam in some sense, right? It's worth also reminding ourselves that the original resolution by Pakistan of 1999 was reference to terrorism. So the Pakistanis were upset that Islam is being associated with terrorism, and that's why it's necessary to have a resolution on the defamation of Islam. So actually the two things are very connected, right? Because they saw that Islam was being brought into disrepute because of the kind of attention which was given to terrorism and the connection with the Muslim religion. Now, sorry, did you have a question? Maybe I've done a detour.
What I wanted to understand is,
Yes.
all we're talking till now,
Yes.
Dr. Shah, about backdoor entry in a sense. But do you see this ever becoming encoded in real law in the UK? And what kind of responses are you seeing to such efforts around the world? I mean, talk a little bit also about the India's efforts to say that, well, actually, no religion should ever be attacked. Everybody should be
Yeah.
respected in the United Nations. But is that even feasible? Is that even possible?
Yeah, that's the very interesting sort of questions. Now, this backdoor question, which keeps coming up, I mean, that is a relevant issue. So far, I've tried to suggest that there's a kind of infusion of ideas of Islamophobia in public discourse and local authority resolutions, and even at the United Nations level, you've got this kind of pressure. Can it concretize into a hard law? Yes, you can. It can, right? So have a look at a bill that's not completely become legislation in the United States Congress, but I forget the exact name of it, International Islamophobia Act or something like that it's called. It was introduced by the Somali representative in the United States Congress, and backed by a lot of other Democrat Congress people. And it's wound its way through various stages. And I believe at the moment it's sitting in the House of Representatives Foreign Relations Committee. So it hasn't been passed, but it has had a lot of support amongst the Congress people. Right? Now, that legislation specifically refers to Islamophobia. But what it does is to say that Islamophobia is a form of anti-Muslim hate, right? So it interprets Islamophobia as anti-Muslim hate. Now, of course, it begs the question, what is anti-Muslim hate, right? Do we refer back to the United Nations resolutions and say, well, actually any act or any speech act against Islam is captured by this? Now, the peculiarity of the American proposed legislation is that it doesn't apply to the United States. It's actually a tack on to the legislation on international religious freedom and establishes a monitoring agency which, under the auspices of the United States government, which should monitor the extent of Islamophobia being practiced in every country except the United States. So it's pretty much like the international religious freedom legislation, right? Which says do you have religious freedom in your country? Don't worry about us, but we're going to monitor you. So in the same way, the United States proposes to monitor every other country in the world for the extent of Islamophobia that exists in that country, right? Now, of course, the United Kingdom could be under the microscope of the US government, right? Because there may be Muslim organizations who put out the word that, Muslims are under attack, or Islam is being criticized, and, it's all unfair, and Islam is being misrepresented, and so on and so forth. And therefore, we are a country in which Islamophobia is rife, right? You could have something like an allegation that, oh, look at the number of Muslims who are being monitored under the anti-terrorism legislation. And it happens to be that the majority of those people who are being monitored are actually Muslim, right? And there is always this thing about the far right and, the far right movements and the threat of extremism from them and so on. But actually, it's without question that most of the people who are under suspicion of acts of terrorism or being somehow engaged in radical activities are Muslim, right? So is that an instance of Islamophobia? Maybe, yeah. Will the US government take the view that Britain breaches the US legislation and therefore legitimately comes under scrutiny of the United States government? Okay, so that's one model. The other thing you can have, I already mentioned that there are religious hatred laws. There are laws to do with religious aggravation, which you can tack on to the ordinary offense. In addition to that, obviously, what you can do, short of passing legislation, is to, let's say, use an agency like the Equality and Human Rights Commission, right, which is our national equality and human rights body. And you could have them introduce a code of practice, right, which would then be applicable to all employers and universities, schools, and so on and so forth. And should you breach a provision of that code, it could be used against you in litigation, right? So in that implicit, in a sense, as you rightly say, a kind of backdoor way, you could have a definition of Islamophobia, which may mirror the all-party parliamentary group definition or some other version from the United Nations or indeed the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And you could have it inserted in some kind of code of practice, right, which has a quasi-legal weight, right? So in that way, you would push people, right, to stop talking about Islam and Muslims, right? And if you don't, then it could be used as evidence against you in a court of law, right? So in that way, and I think it's probably something like that that's going to happen in Britain, right? Because you've got a new government now, as everybody knows. And although the Muslim vote largely, there's actually a campaign known as the Muslim vote, right, which orchestrated the Muslim vote to go against many sitting or candidates which the Labour Party had proposed, and notwithstanding that, you might say that the Labour Party wants to re-establish a kind of relationship with the Muslim voter. And therefore, this would be one of the things that the Labour Party or the new Labour government could do in order to ingratiate themselves with the general Muslim voter and thereby attract back some of the votes that it's lost during the 2024 general election. So you could have something like that happening.
Well, in conclusion, then, Dr. Shah, if you would reflect on two things. One is the repercussions of things like this, other faiths wanting similar protection, and also India's sort of broad view that, well, if you have to do this, protect all religions. How do those two things work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm minded to be quite critical of the Indian position, particularly the one that the Indian government took in the United Nations, I think, was it the General Assembly recently? I think earlier this year, in which, in response to a resolution on Islamophobia, they said, well, the Indian representative said, well, we're in favor of protecting all religions, not just one. I don't think that was a correct move. And I would very much recommend that the Ministry of External Affairs officials, and particularly the legal officials, I'm sure they have some, read the volume by a Swiss professor of international law at the University of Zurich, Lorenz Langer, who has done a more or less exhaustive study of what's been happening at the United Nations with respect to the resolutions that I've been speaking about, the defamation of religion, Islamophobia, and so on, and of course, what the OIC has been pushing for in the background. To understand what the history of this kind of initiatives are, and not to get entrapped in the quest for suppressing expression with respect to religion, right? Because that becomes a kind of global liability once you go down that route, right? Now, I can understand what kind of position they're coming from, because they've inherited the colonial legislation, which does try to clamp down on speech which is critical of any religion. But this is British legislation, right? It's not Indian, right? Now, I'm not saying that within the Indian culture, there isn't some kind of ethos which constitutes a backdrop, right, of civility and civil speech, right? And I don't think it's necessary for it to be, let's say, the same as the liberal conception, where you can say, well, anything is up for criticism, right? We have the right to criticize. Any belief can be criticized and so on, right? Any practice can be criticized. You can say whatever you want. We should have a very high threshold for freedom of speech. I'm not arguing that, right? Particularly from an Indian cultural perspective, I think that the norms of civility in a culture like India can reconcile the freedom of speech and the freedom to criticize people, but also to maintain a certain standard of civility, right? I'm not sure that the present provisions of the Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita, which basically word for word copies the old Indian Penal Code provisions. There's no change, right? So the would-be decolonizers who've drafted that code, I'm afraid have failed, right? Because they've simply not put enough thought into what should go into any provisions that replace the ones contained in the old Indian Penal Code. And I think that's one of the big failings of the code, is that in many respects, it just simply fails to think through what is appropriate for the Indian society and culture, right? Now, once you translate that into discussions of the United Nations, you're basically repeating the same sentiment, I think, right? So that's why I'm critical of the way in which the Indian government representative put the relevant issue. What they should have done, having read Lorenz Langer's fantastic book, is to say that there is no way on earth that we are going to tolerate resolutions which repeatedly introduce this conception of either defamation of religion or Islamophobia. We're just not interested, right? Because we're against any type of blasphemy law. And I think that's consistent with the Indian cultural tradition, right? That there is no conception of blasphemy as such, right? Which is it's a kind of Semitic conception. It doesn't belong in India really, right? Notwithstanding its huge Muslim population. And in many ways, it's actually worked against the ethos of the Indian traditions, in the sense that even in India, you see a greater protection being offered to Islam, right? If you look at what's happened to somebody like Nupur Sharma, for example, right? She's just now come out into the open, right? After the 2024 elections in India.
That too barely.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure she can't walk around and so on.
No, not at all.
She would just be killed, but that's no reason for the Indians, the Indian legal system to hold on to the old colonial idea, which has always protected Muslims more than anybody else, right? So as far as India is concerned, I think two things. First of all, let's think very clearly about what is consistent with the Indian culture and traditions. Secondly, please be aware of the effect of what you're saying at the international level after having researched the issue thoroughly, right? Rather than simply a knee-jerk reaction, which looks like it's pleasing everybody, but it's going to be very highly damaging in future.
Prakash, we'll have to leave it at that. Thanks very much for explaining in great detail whether the UK is bringing in a blasphemy law through the back door, and indeed what's really happening with the debate on blasphemy laws around the world, including in India. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Cheers.